Often we don't know that much about the early years in the lives of the people that we read about in the Bible. That's not true about Samuel. The Bible begins Samuel's story before he was even born. God chose Samuel from birth to serve him in many different roles, just like he did with Moses. From an assistant in the temple, to priest, to judge, to prophet, and even as a counselor to the kings. Samuel played a pivotal role in Israel's history. Samuel was used by God to help Israel transition from a loose tribal system into an organized, powerful nation under a powerful monarchy. He chose and anointed the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David, and he served as the last of Israel's judges and the first major prophet. He's also mentioned in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, which is the Bible's hall of faith. Samuel's life, from his childhood where he heard and followed after God's voice, to his later years when he was counseling kings to faithfully follow God, his life shows us that a person's greatness is directly connected to their relationship with God. God used Samuel to appoint Israel's first king, Saul. Saul was a big guy. He was literally head and shoulders taller than all the other men in Israel. People literally looked up to Saul. God had Samuel anoint Saul with oil, which symbolized the fact that he was set aside for God's purposes. Even the kings of this earth are subject to the King of heaven. Leaders have a lot of power, but in the end, every leader will give an account of how he managed or she managed the leadership opportunity that God has loaned them. Saul started out fairly well, but soon he became impatient with God's timetables and he became very self-willed in his leadership. This eventually cost him dearly. Saul is an interesting character. While he technically followed God's ways early on, through observing the sacrifices and seeking God's direction for the government, these actions appear to simply be religious observances, almost like good luck charms, rather than a genuine desire to walk with God and know Him and His ways. Saul seemed to view the religious observances as a necessary step in achieving his personal leadership goals. Samuel served God, who did miracles. Saul just jumped through religious hoops in order to try to convince God to do miracles. Samuel wanted God for who he was, but Saul wanted God to bless what he wanted to do. This eventually led to some of the most devastating decisions of Saul's life, and eventually it cost him everything: his sanity, his kingdom, his life. Because Saul viewed Samuel's role as spiritual leader of Israel as just a lucky charm that simply required the right ingredients to make God do what he needed done, Saul eventually gave in to impatience and pragmatism, and he decided to circumvent God's process and take things into his own hands. He decided to lead the army in sacrifices on his own, even though God had said that the priests were supposed to lead in this area. It's never right to do wrong, even if you're just trying to get a chance to do the right thing. In America, we get caught up in situational ethics so easily. We often overlook doing things the right way as long as we get to the right ending. If you have to do things in the wrong way in order to get to the right answer, it's still wrong. Jesus said, "Seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and He will give you everything you need." That's in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. He's saying to seek God's ways and His will to be done in every area of our lives, and then live rightly. Live our lives God's way, for God. A real relationship with God drives us to this. Religion, used as a good luck charm, often digresses into religious observances that lack any real heart or passion. We often find ourselves frustrated with God because we feel like He should be doing more to further our agenda. That's just not how it works. Eventually, Saul becomes so full of himself that he ignores God's explicit instructions, and he does what he wants to do with the king that he captures in battle. Instead of obeying God, Saul decides to humiliate the king publicly, probably because that's what other kings of this era would have done to their captors. When Samuel calls him out on it, Saul starts trying to appease God with sacrifices. Maybe if he could just do enough religious rites and perform enough penance, God will overlook this little sin. God tells Samuel to declare that disobedience is not a little thing. Disobedience is the same as Satan worship. It's mutiny, treason against the Creator. God said that simple obedience is better than sacrifice. Because of Saul's self-serving leadership and lack of genuine desire to serve God, which resulted in religious duty without any genuine obedience, Samuel declared that God was going to remove Saul from leadership, and ultimately he was going to give the kingdom to another person. Saul's kingdom was not something that he earned or deserved or possessed. God had chosen him to serve God's purposes and to lead God's people as God's ambassador, not as a self-serving dictator. Over the next few years, we discover that Saul starts coming apart at the seams, literally losing his mind, trying to keep what never really was his in the first place. Every leader must remember that what we have is not our own. Everything is on loan from God, and we're just to manage it well. Saul forgot this simple truth, and he lost everything. God chose young David, who was chasing after God's heart, to be the next king, and in the direct lineage of Jesus himself. And while David's life wasn't perfect, the overall direction of his life was in pursuit of God and his glory, not as a lucky charm, but in genuine, loving relationship with his Creator. And God blessed him beyond anything that he could imagine. If you're a follower of Christ, you have been set apart for God. He's chosen you for his purposes. One of the adventures of the Christian life is to explore and discover God's purposes for your life and to really live them out. All three of these men, like you, were set aside for God's call, God's purposes. Two of them, David and Samuel, thrived for the most part in their calling, being set apart for God's glory. And they experienced God's blessings and became great heroes of the faith. Saul, however, set aside God's call, and he tried to become the hero of his own story and wound up forfeiting his calling. Saul pursued power and fame and riches and tried to use God to get them, and he lost it all. David pursued God and his will, and God gave him power and fame and riches. Just like Jesus said, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need. Jesus taught us that there's a paradox to life. When you try to get it by any means possible, you lose it. But when you give it away to God, you find it. That's why he taught us to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven."